All right. Well, good afternoon. My name is David Lipset, CEO of the Housing Assistance Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. We've got many people gathered here in the room at HAC's DC headquarters and several hundred joining us by live stream webcast from nearly every state in the nation. The Housing Assistance Council is the nation's intermediary for rural communities. Our core work is in affordable housing, and our approach is to grow the strength of local organizations across rural America that have the capacity to help the communities in which they are. We're a lender and a CDFI. We provide training and technical assistance to groups navigating the complexity of affordable housing development, and we are in many ways the information backbone for rural America. We track the trends, economic and demographic, to know what happens and what works in rural communities. We communicate that with you, the affordable housing industry, and with our friends in elected office. HAC's research has brought us to today's event. With help from hundreds of experts, practitioners, interested parties, many of you gathered here today through interviews and other contributions. We're releasing the Rental Housing for a 21st Century Rural America report. The report examines the current state of the public's multi-billion-dollar investment and 55 years of commitment to supporting multifamily housing in small towns and rural places. It's commonly known amongst all of us in our community as Section 515 rentals. Please know we're grateful to USDA, whose contribution of data and a portion of the funding made this report possible. So simply put, our stock of 515s is in steep decline, and the reality is a deeper crisis is looming. 533,000 affordable apartments were built with this program. Today, 416,000 remain. Unfortunately, the 120,000 lost rental units will be joined by thousands more. In the coming years, over half of the remaining units are over 30 years old and have mortgages nearing maturity. It's a conversation and a term that we have used often in this community. A maturing 515 mortgage ends the public's stake in the property and removes guarantees that the rent of these apartments will remain affordable to those in need. Today's report is just half of our project. A companion report, a platform for production, will be released in a few weeks. It dives further into the fact that USDA and other federally subsidized affordable housing is a finite resource. It calls on the communities represented here today and on the attending by webcast to think about production and a call for more rental housing in these communities. This work was conducted by HAC in conjunction with our partner, the Urban Institute. So let's get started. HAC's Director of Research, Lance George, and his extraordinary team are going to run us through the data and the report and its findings, including a set of recommendations. We also have a panel that I'm thrilled to see joining us here today of 3 leading experts in the field, all of which have successfully completed deals to preserve 515 housing. So thank you all for gathering here, and I look forward to the discussion. Lance, take it away.
Thanks, David. I'd just like to reiterate David's welcome to everyone here and everyone joining us on the live stream, and also reiterate that thanks to all of you. In many respects, almost everyone here is here for a reason, because you're impassioned about this issue or you want to learn more about it. But you also helped either directly, or I'm somewhat confident, directly or indirectly, with the work that we're presenting today. And in that vein, I would like to acknowledge the HAC research team that did, put this report together, quite frankly. There were many long hours, kind of running our head into brick walls. Arguments, most of the arguments were on my end, but we put together this report. It was a really robust report and an august team. And I'm really appreciative of them, so I wanted to acknowledge the team first. You'll be hearing from some of them, but notably we have Dr. Keith Wiley, who's a research associate, our senior research associate, and our resident data guru, Mike Feinberg, who's our policy analyst, Leslie Strauss, who's also a senior policy analyst, and then we're Christina Davila and Dan Stern helping out on the production, and we have Austin Moser, a member of our research team. So it was a team effort. A lot of work went into this, and we really appreciate that. So the report that's being released today is 130 pages long. So, and we all want to go back and read that. I will say, quite frankly, given the magnitude and the importance and the complexity of this issue, it could be 3 times as long, quite frankly. But we really only have about 20 or 30 minutes today, because I've been told that if you can't say what you're going to say in 20 minutes, don't say it. So we're going to try to really focus on that part and then really turn to, which I think is just as, this is not to marginalize or minimize the data analysis, but the panel that we have speaking, I think, is just as valuable to the data, quite frankly. So I'm really looking forward to that. We're going to try to run through this. The point is 300 pages, tens of thousands of data points, and we're going to really cover this relatively quickly. So it's kind of a small, thin overview, and there's a lot more discussion to be had here. But we welcome this opportunity to share this with you because we think it does really benefit the body of work. So I've been known as I'm really good at bad analogies. And I was trying to think about this morning, so to come up with another good bad analogy. And the one I had was kind of, so it kind of, I can't even think of what they are, right? So binoculars, as I was going over this yesterday. So when you look in binoculars, oftentimes it's really fuzzy, right? You have to kind of adjust that knob in the middle to make sure that it's clear or make it clear. When we initially looked into the binoculars, quite frankly, it was really fuzzy. And this is not to cast aspersions or make accusations, but quite frankly, I think that, and this is well documented, a lot of the information and data platform around this issue is quite fuzzy and quite murky. And we spent a lot of time, and this is research parlance, triangulating and quality control tracking and making sure that data was in much better order. And quite frankly, that I think is one of the biggest accomplishments here. We didn't accomplish everything we wanted in this research project, but I do think that was a major accomplishment to get that data in order so we can help build sound policies and strategies. And there was a lot of work, a lot of late nights, and again, talking about running into brick walls. So that was a big issue for us, quite frankly, working on the data quality and the data analysis. So I think that's a huge, huge benefit of this particular work. I'll also quickly refer back to the bad analogy. We just picked up the binoculars for the first time and rubbed the dust off of it, like many of you, I think. This is when you look through binoculars, you're going to see the larger perspective, and I think we're oftentimes focused on some of the smaller issues or some of the technical issues. We're looking at our own projects or certain areas, and that was the goal of, and I think one of the benefits of this project was to look very broad and very wide at this issue in a larger perspective than it had been before. So I do think that was another accomplishment. And then finally, the other major general observation I would make about the report is that it was comprehensive. And when we were doing the initial work, the literature review and the research work on this, we would often find, perspectives from particular angles, from the owner's angle, from the government's angle, USDA's angle, the tenant's perspective, or even the public good, right? What's the public good? And I do think that all of those are very important, and we try to take all of them into account because they will all be needed, quite frankly, to help solve this problem. It's a public-private partnership, and that's very important. I would say to return very last to the bad binoculars analogy. When you look into those binoculars, so I look into them, then I hand them to David. Invariably, I think his eyesight might be keener or probably more keen than mine. He often has the focus that is right. So I will say, when we looked at those 4 perspectives, I wouldn't say there was always consensus, but I do think it's important that we actually looked at them and looked at the broader perspective of this particular public good. So I will, thank you, Christina. You should always have one slide that no one can read. So I'll just get that out of the way first, right? To quickly kind of put this in focus, the important thing to remember from this slide is to say that we're looking at the research really encompasses 4 main areas or 4 main issues. And we'll kind of go through those, the 4 main topics. The The first of which is simply a picture of USDA Section 515 housing, the focus of the research and the focal product. So I am somewhat continually amazed, because this is such a part of our daily life and our daily vernacular, how many people are somewhat unaware, and these are people who are really well versed in the housing world, of this particular resource. They may have heard about it, but they don't know how important it is and how vital it is to rural communities. So we did, I thought, a pretty good job in the report of providing a primer. Now, some might think we wasted space here going over this, but quite frankly, I thought it was needed. It is there's a lot of nuance and a lot of complication here. So we put in an overview, kind of a primer on the program and how it intersects with rural communities and rural people. This is just a geographic illustration of the scope of the USDA Section 515 properties. So if you look at the map, each dot represents a property. And it does have a broad scope across rural America, across the nation, quite frankly. So they're roughly somewhere in the neighborhood, and it changes day to day. And when I was talking about some of those data quality issues, we were hammering out one last night. We were just looking and said, that can't be right. So just to reinforce that, but there are roughly 13,000 and change properties, right? That does vary by source, and quite frankly, any given day, quite frankly. That could change, but about 13,000 properties, housing more than 415,000 units of affordable housing. So you do, again, you see a broad scope across the United States. I think an interesting point to note is their USDA properties are located in every state, in most of the territories, and 87% of US counties, right? So it's again, a very broad brush. But you will notice, and I think this is important to note, that while it does have a broad focus across the nation, or a broad presence across the nation, there are large concentrations that could be impacted in the Southeast and the Midwestern United States, right? So I do think that's important to note, that those two geographic regions could be impacted. In fact, roughly 40% of all units are in the Southeast alone. So very important to those areas. Another element that I would just like to touch on in this vein of, the picture of the housing is the residents themselves, or the occupants of these properties. So these, in some levels, these are the most vulnerable residents or tenants in the United States. And I do think I fall into this trap as well. Quite frankly, we use this vernacular in the world of this jargon, units and properties and projects. And quite frankly, these are homes and communities for over 600,000 people. So it's really important to that group, but they are vulnerable and at risk. The average household income of a Section 515 tenant is $13,600. That's roughly 75% below the national average. Nearly 2/3 of residents are either elderly or disabled. So, and there are a large number of these properties where there's single head of household females or elderly females. So again, a very vulnerable population. This is where we spent, the next section is where we spent the bulk. I would say that's the body of the report, or the body of the research, was projecting the loss of USDA property and its impact or its implications. So I think it's undeniable that maturing mortgages are the most pressing preservation issue now, kind of in the multifamily space, but also just generally in the rural housing space, right? So this is a large issue. This is where the complexity comes in, and I'll be candid, there are others in the room that know this much better than I. You could spend hours on some of these technical topics that we are just briefly mentioning. But I think this is a major dynamic where mortgages are maturing on a curve. So the blue lines in this chart are the properties, and that's the maturity, that when they are estimated to mature, the loan matures, and at that point, there are a lot of other implications that happen, or a lot of other issues that are going to happen when the loan matures. It could go offline as affordable housing, it could lose the rental assistance or whole ring, so there are a lot of implications for that maturity date. These are estimates, and the orange line are the number of the commensurate units in those properties. But you'll see we've segmented these into 4 or 5 distinct groups, the first of which is the build-up phase, and that's now through 2027. We're on average, roughly, it's estimated roughly 74 units or 74 properties will mature each year. Then you hit this noticeable trend up, what we call the first peak. So we've used mountain climbing. I'm not neither a bird watcher, so I don't know about my binoculars, nor am I a mountain climber, but we've used these kind of mountain terms. Then the second peak, and these are somewhere in the neighborhood of 10-year increments. Then the summit peaks around 2040, where you get the most number of maturing properties. And then what we call the descent down to 2050. If it went on a pure trend, all properties would mature by 2050. And again, this has far-ranging implications. Just to look at that geographically, I'm sorry, this is the second slide that you can't read. But these are all the properties by their maturity date. And the more orange the color is, the more elevated, the more earlier that it matures. So the more orange the color is, the build-up phase and the first peak. And then you get into the blues, and those are later on in the maturity cycle. So I know this makes no sense to anyone, because it will basically, there's a lot of random pattern there, but I do think we provided some illustrations to help to give a little context and a little more illustration to this kind of maturing mortgage curve by geography. We use raster analysis or heat mapping to look at these by each phase. So you'll notice this is the buildup phase where they were currently in. We're roughly, kind of ambling along at 70, 75 or maybe 100 unit or properties per year. And you'll notice the brighter orange areas where you have a greater concentration of properties that are expected to mature. And you'll notice some of these hot spots, particularly up in the upper Midwest, particularly in Minnesota and in the central Midwest, right? You move to the second phase, and you see this is where the wall starts, right? It really hits. And you'll notice a much more dispersed pattern across the nation, but still hot spots largely still in the Midwest and in the southern United States. You move to the second peak, and you'll notice actually for the first time Western units starting to come online, where you get larger maturities in the western parts of the United States, still in the Midwest and in the Southeast. And again, I think it's important to note that a lot of this activity is going to happen in those regions. Now, areas where you don't have anything, there are 515 properties here. This is just another way of looking at it. It's a density analysis, quite frankly. So it's not to minimize those areas, but this is where you're going to see the greatest concentration. This is the summit. And actually the summit, even though it has the highest number in 2040, it's actually a period of relative decline in some of these. So you'll see actually it's pulled back a little bit, but again, more focused geographically in the western United States. So you have more concentration. And then finally, the final phase, which that's really far out, but I think there's some important notes that Keith and the other analysts will talk about. You see definite geographic patterns in this period where there are many more what we would call persistently poor or high poverty communities that are starting to come online. You'll notice the Southern Black Belt, the lower Mississippi Delta, and portions of Appalachia. So a lot of those units were built in this period, and it's just an interesting geographic note. So that's some of the geography looking at the maturing mortgage issue and the maturing mortgage crisis. I would say, and then I'm going to turn it over to the analysts, but another important distinction, and I know the panel will talk about this, is that maturing mortgage is not the only issue. Prepayments are still a very important, significant component of this equation. I don't know if I could honestly tell you exactly every prepayment is a relatively complicated issue, but it's still an important dynamic here. And these are units where owners have the right and the ability to prepay the loan up to a certain date. There's a lot of complexity or some complexity in there. But it's important to note that this is still a part of the equation. It's not just the maturing mortgages. It's also the prepayment component. Roughly, our estimate is roughly 38% to 40% of the properties are still eligible to prepay. So that's still an important dynamic. This is just a geographic illustration of properties that left the portfolio between 2006 and 2016, a 10-year period. And the orange dots indicate those that prepaid. The others were for another reason, and we don't necessarily know that reason. That's, again, goes back to that issue of data clarity, and we just simply don't know. But it tells you that this is an important issue, and it's particularly been focused here in that upper Midwest. That's where a lot of older properties are, quite frankly, so you're going to see more activity in that area. Now, maturing mortgages will probably become the dominant issue, but we don't want to overlook this particular issue as well. And then finally, this is just another illustration. I talked before about the difference between properties. So there are a lot of properties in the Midwest, but there are actually more units in the southeastern United States. Properties tend to be smaller in certain geographic areas. And this is just a bubble map showing that exact same information, but showing the number of units that were lost. So you have a lot of smaller properties here in the Midwest, but in the South, you might have fewer prepayments. You have a much larger focus of units. That's the real, what we would call the descriptive component of this. Next, we're going to move into some of our analyses, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wiley at this point to kind of give you that overview. So thank you, Keith.
Thanks, Lance. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Sorry, my drink here, I tend to get parched and when I get talking a lot. But thanks a lot for coming. And I'm normally the data guy. I do a lot of data work. And for this project, we did a lot of work on essentially assessing the risk or trying to identify the areas maybe where the properties might mature, the owners might want to leave the program, and also risk from the perspective of the impact, where it might have more impact on certain communities, right? So you can think of it one way. We essentially, like if you were the owner, we looked at communities, and that's the first part we're going to talk about, is where the owner might have an incentive to get out of the program or leave the program because of the market. And then the other part is going to be due to the risk of, okay, these areas are going to lose a large part of their housing stock, so from the community's perspective. So the first part, we created what we call a risk index kind of for the counties, the markets or the counties. And what we did was I went in for each of the counties and we created one with three elements: demographics, economics, and rental market characteristics. And there were two measures for each one of these. For the demographics, it was population change and population mobility, and essentially that was measured at the percent of the population that was in another county previous year. We also used the unemployment rate, and we used the percent of population with a BA degree for the economic characteristics, and then we had the rental market measures was the rental vacancy rate and the change in renter occupied units. And so what we did was I essentially did, we ranked the properties for population change and the unemployment rate and the rental vacancy rate. We used 1990 to 2000, 2000 to 2010, and 2010 to 2015. So we tried to look at long-term trends with those three measures. And for the population mobility, percent of population with a degree, and the change in renter occupancy rates, we used the most recent 5 years, the change. What we were trying to do is, with this measure, I wanted to make sure we consider both the long-term trends and the more current activities. And so essentially we summed the rankings up, and everybody got a score based, and they were either ranked as declining, weak, stable, strong, growing, or no activity. And as Lance pointed out, there's no activity cases would be cases where there were no units, like say Cook County, Illinois is not eligible, but there's also some in the West where there just weren't very many people and there were no properties. And so we essentially ranked about 2,700 counties, and you can see this is a distribution of the rankings. There's the declining, the weak, the stable, the strong, and the growing. And it's pretty standard distribution. We use this to rank them, but what we're concerned with is the declining and the growing, because we're considering if it's a declining market, it may not be considered profitable by the owner, so they may not want to be in there, so it put pressure on them. And the growing market's kind of self-evident. If it's a real hot market, you might have alternative uses that you can do the property for. Maybe you'd want to prepay or you'd want to get out of the market. And we found out there's 1,600 properties, and one of these two, declining or growing, and most of them are into growing. There's 135 counties declining and 200 growing. And here's what they look like. And it's 1,600 properties in both. About 1,000 are in the growing market, and about 600 are in the declining market. And here it is on the map. And this map is not necessarily the best, but the orange show you the counties where it's growing, the hottest markets essentially, and the blue show you the coldest. So I'll show you in the next slide, it shows a little better, but if you notice the orange are more like in Southern California, up around the Seattle area, Minneapolis, and some of the larger cities in Texas and the East Coast. And then if you notice the cooler markets are like Central Appalachia and the Southeast. And I think this next figure does a better job of showing what we did. Here's the properties that are going to mature are from the portfolio, and you see the blue ones are the ones in the declining markets, and it's kind of where you might expect, right? Central Appalachia, the southeastern United States. And if you see the ones in the hot markets, they're around like Minneapolis, you see Seattle, and some more of the suburban jurisdictions. And so this is kind of, it kind of falls into patterns what you might think, the areas where there might be an incentive for the owner to pull the property out of the program. And I think this is a good way to look at it. Again, the measures can be manipulated or changed a little bit to get it there, but I think that index is pretty strong. Now, another consideration, and one I actually like better even though I'm a data guy, is what would the risk be with regards to the community, right? Because maybe that's the biggest thing, right? Who would be impacted the most by these maturing properties? And so, because maybe it would take a lot of their rental housing stock away. So what we did was we went in and we estimated, we summed up the total number of subsidized units, and this is project-based units in each county, and that was section 202, Section 8 project-based, public housing authority units, low-income housing tax credits. And what I did was I calculated the percent in each county that were Section 515. And what we wanted to do is say, what would it be, if they all declined, where would it have the most impact? Because these are subsidized units. So what we did was we identified the counties where a majority of the subsidized units were 515s. Therefore, there's a lot more risk there. They could lose a lot of their subsidized housing units. And there was over 300 counties that actually fell into this classification. And we put the properties on here in yellow. You can see there's a large number in Missouri and Iowa and Maine and the Dakotas. And in 80 of these counties, one of the properties actually meets the 50% threshold. So what you really have going on here in a lot of these places is there's not a lot of subsidized units, and the ones that do exist are 515. So you can see in these cases, these counties or governments might want to be concerned about the maturing portfolio because it could have a big impact on them. And the other way, the original way that I had done it was I looked at the overall rental housing stock. And so what we did was we took the last 3 ACS estimates for each county and we created an average of the total of the renter occupied units. And we said what percentage of them would be Section 515 those occupied units. And if it was 10% or more share, we essentially said that was an at-risk county because they could lose 1 out of every 10 rental units. And actually, I think the reason why I chose 10% is about half of all rental units are normally affordable and the other half are not affordable. So if you think of that, this would be almost 1 in 5 affordable units if we consider most Section 515 units to be affordable. So that's a lot of units. So we identified 250 counties where the properties would actually be, where if they lost the maturing units, it would be over 10% of the housing stock. And I think and you notice there's a lot more in the South here. And that's because a lot of those units are subsidized, so it didn't reach the other threshold, but it does mean it's a large, substantial portion of the housing stock. And you can see Maine has a large number of units. And so I think this is also another way to look at it. Maybe you just don't want to look at the subsidized unit, but you want to look at the overall rental housing stock and what could be the impact. And as Lance pointed out, this is another one I think is important, not just necessarily the rental stock, but the amount of need in the community. And what we did was we wanted to find those communities that were the poorest areas and say, what might the impact be on them? So the USDA ERS has their persistent poverty measure, which is essentially 20% are poverty or greater for the last 3 decades. Now they're using 4. And so what we did was we said 20% or higher poverty rate, 1990, 2000, 2010. We identified those counties, and that's pretty chronic conditions. There's 395 of them. And 90% of them had a Section 515 property. And so this shows you that, these are if you have 20% or high poverty for 3 decades, that's considerable, need. And particularly in the Southeast. And if we were to overlay this with a map of high needs areas, you could see Central Appalachia is right there. The Southeast is right there. The Mississippi Delta, the border colonies, Native American lands. And in the case of like Mississippi and Louisiana, half of the Section 515 properties are in a persistently poor county. So this is I think, a very important consideration. And another consideration was similar to need as we looked at affordability as regards to cost burden units. And the cost burden is if you pay 30% or more of your income in housing. And this is particularly an issue with renters in general. In rural areas, about 47% of renters are cost burden. So what we did was we identified the counties where half or more of the renters are already cost burdened. And we said how many units are in those counties, because you can see that those areas already have a problem. This would exacerbate it. And see there's about 5,400 properties in those areas. And it's hard to tell on this map. I know the oranges kind of go together. I actually like orange. I have some Oriole fan, I guess, but struggling still. But if you notice in California, Florida, and North Carolina, those 3 states have a quarter of the actual occupied units. So that's just another way to look at it. Maybe they're not necessarily in a persistent poverty category, but if they lose these units, it'll have a pretty severe impact on their rental stock and exacerbate an already affordability issue. And this is one that I like to put in there because people oftentimes don't think of the programs necessarily being diverse because it's rural. And a majority of the tenants actually are I think, white non-Hispanic tenants. But if you look at it, break it down, it's like much of rural America. It is, in fact, very diverse. It's just that people are concentrated in certain areas. So if you look at this, over 2,400 properties have a majority of their tenants are a racial or ethnic minority. And so you can see exactly what you might think. In the Southeast, it's African American. In the South, it's Hispanic, and you see Native American in the Plains. And the reason why I bring this up is you could see where maybe a group or population might be adversely affected if a whole bunch of units, maturing mortgage properties, happen at the same time. So this is just another consideration. I think it's an important consideration for the portfolio, and it speaks to like the nuances of the portfolio, right? If I'm just looking at all the data, sometimes I don't see it, but when I look at the intricacies of it, I can see where it affects populations and communities in many different ways. Now, another area we wanted to touch on was we wanted to try to look back, and I think this is an area of future work could really do a lot. What we wanted to say was, well, we know some people left the program, right? Well, what can we learn from them? Because, you know, that's probably stronger than me trying to predict models that would say whether so-and-so would mature, he would take his property out or prepay. It's better off to see what people actually did. So what we did was, as Lance has shown some of that, we had identified properties that exited 2006 to 2016. I think it's 1,900 or so. And what we wanted to say was, how do they compare to the other properties in the portfolio? Is there any outstanding characteristic? Is there something about them that makes them unique, makes them interesting? So then we tell us something about the owners and tell us something about the decision making. And you can see where this could be important to policymakers. Maybe they have finite resources and you're trying to, you know, save as many units as possible or alter things. So what we did was we created a model. And the model was just a basic model where I put all properties in that had been in operation before 1990 and the ones that left. And it was just a logistic regression model. I don't want to get into details because it'll get boring and, you know, if you won't. But basically what it is, we wanted to see if certain characteristics of the owner or property or of the location or of the service area were related to the ones that left as opposed to the other ones. And we did find some stuff out. We found that there was some association. If you were a nonprofit owner, you were least likely. It was least likely to leave. One of the ones that I liked was the small size property. You were more likely, which makes some sense, right? If you have a 2 or 3 unit building, it might be easier for you to leave, but you might want to, you know, redo your loan or something if you have a larger property because you have more invested in maintaining the housing stock. Where and when mattered. These were really control variables, but it was what you would think. The older the property is, the more likely it would mature and leave, or depending on where they started, because as Lance always says, this is a developer-driven program. So more likely if you're in the Plains to leave because that's where most of the early development went. And market characteristics did have an impact. Like if you see areas where there was, or did have an association, I don't want to say impact because this is just this is just an association, but areas where population growth occurred, there was more likely associated with maturing or leaving the program. And this is one of the things where I always say this, so and people get tired of hearing it from me, but this is where I think in the future, like better data, a better collected data. If we could start now, we have this build-up period, right? And if you can collect better data, the kind of information I think would be really useful and would make this approach, or really another approach, better would be, did they prepay and leave? Did they just mature and leave? Or did they change the loan terms and now they extend it? Could we compare those properties going forth in the future? And then could we get information, like Lance talks about, more information on the ownership? Was it that they own a single property? Was it a mom and pop operation? Was it a management operation? I'd really like to know the vacancy rates in each one, the consistent vacancy rates. Knowing them, and then if I can put it into a model or I can put it into a factor analysis or something, it might tell you a little bit more about the decision making of the individuals. And one other thing before I hand this over is we tried a little bit to look at this. Just one other key element is it's unclear to me exactly what happens to these properties absolutely when they leave. And I think that'll be talked about a little bit here. And that was another element we tried to look into a little bit. In other words, when they do leave, they mature and they're out of this, do they maintain their affordable housing? Or do they move on to some other regular market rent, or do they go into a whole nother use? And I think that's another important element, and all that could kind of go together with the data collection efforts. But I'm going to turn it back over to Lance, and thank you.
Thanks, Keith. I think I just want to make one brief observation on Keith's work. That's just the tip of the iceberg, and I'll be very candid about this. It's lucky we don't have a mutiny here that I'm actually standing here, because I would go back to these guys and say, run the model again. Quite frankly, they did a mountain of work, and there's a lot of statistical rigor here, because we ran model after analysis after analysis, and many of them simply did not have the statistical reliability. I would love to say some things, but they just simply didn't. So these guys have a lot of data integrity. I would throw anything out, but they didn't. They said, you can't say that because we don't know. So the research is really sound, really solid. I wish we could present a lot more. We just did not have the data reliability, and I think that's a major issue. And they're really, that last model, we wanted to put it in, but it didn't really tell us as much as we'd like to know, but we still want to do that. And we did have some data statistical significance on that particular model. We're going to skip over this one because this is going to be the finale, but I would like to just comment, this is the third major section of the report. It's expert and stakeholder input. I would say in most reports, or a lot of reports, not all of them, this area is often the literature review or the discovery. And quite frankly, the data only gets you so far in this issue. You need to know a lot of the nuance and a lot of the technical specifications and a lot of the issues. So we made this a major component of the report. And you'll notice it's a large body of where we talked to over 60 organizations, hundreds of people through multiple convenings, a lot of different perspectives to help inform what we call the contextual nature of this, right? So to help really provide context to the data. And I'm really, really proud about that part, because I think this really helps inform much more so than just the data alone. We're going to rely on our discussion panel to really fill in on this part. It's an important part of the report. We're going to move on. We're going to skip over to that and look forward to that panel and just look at some of the strategies that came out of the report. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our senior policy analyst, Mike Feinberg, for that. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Lance. This is in case I have my own Marco Rubio moment. So tax analysis provides information about the properties that are at risk of leaving due to maturing mortgages, risk of leaving the USDA portfolio. We know now, at one time, there was estimates of how many mortgages were going to mature over a given time, and they were pretty high. But we now know that there's some more time to look at this issue. Mortgages are maturing at a slower rate than previous estimates had bared out. So we have more time, but delays will result in property losses. Therefore, it's critical that we use the time wisely to protect the government's investments and protect the rural tenants who live there. Preservation strategies need to balance the interest of several parties. You saw lots of pretty graphs and maps. You're just going to see small print in this part of the presentation. So, the four key stakeholders are USDA, the Section 515 owners and prospective owners, the tenants who live in the properties, and the public who is served by the interest. So on USDA is deeply involved in all of the aspects of administering the 515 portfolio and in rural rental preservations. USDA has several sources of public data, but they're not easy to use. They're not all located in one place. Increased scrutiny of the USDA data could improve its usefulness. One of the key findings in a GAO report that was issued in May of 2018 was that the USDA data is not well vetted. A lot of it's collected but not verified. There could be keystroke entries. So there's, and we ran across some of this in trying to look at the numbers when we were doing the analysis. Stakeholders that we talked to recognized that there were costs for USDA to obtain the costs for technology and staffing to do the data collection and the data dissemination. And it was recognized that if funds may not be appropriated by Congress to cover this. So one thought, if we don't get funding from Congress to do this, is to consider fees for preservation to cover the cost of data and collection. At some of the stakeholder meetings, some folks shared that they had used USDA's community facilities or business and industry programs to assist with preservations. But some people didn't know about what that was about. Most of us didn't know what it was about. So another thing USDA could do is help share information on how those programs could assist in preservation efforts. Some field offices have been holding buyer and seller conferences as a means of exchanging information. USDA holds regular stakeholder calls that stakeholders did appreciate for information. USDA has what they call the PIC system. It's the Preservation Information Exchange System, but they indicated that system is not updated on a regular basis, and therefore they didn't consider it reliable. And they also noted, some of the stakeholders noted that USDA state offices mail out their preservation updates, so they didn't really know if all of the preservation information was entered into the PICS system. So that's an area that could be looked at. Stakeholders would like to be able to access more detailed information online in a single source. Such information could include which owners want to leave the program, their contact information, the characteristics of the properties, the amount of rent, the tenants who are living there, and details about the debt against the property. USDA has information about its debt, but a lot of properties have debt from other sources, and that information would be useful to potential purchasers of properties that were going to leave the program. USDA has reports on the number of tenants served and some of the tenant characteristics, but stakeholders are interested in knowing what amount is needed for the rental assistance contracts that need to be renewed. They want to know about the number of rental assistance units that have been retired, and they want to know about the properties at risk of being removed from the program for various reasons. Some other thoughts from the stakeholder sessions: sharing best practices to preserve properties of various size and type in different areas. Detailed information on the properties, like Keith was talking about, the properties that left the program and why they left. Where did the tenants go when they left, when the property left the portfolio? Potential owners and purchasers are key players. Owners face a variety of circumstances and they can benefit from process improvements. USDA offers incentives to owners who apply for prepayment, who apply to prepay their loans, and USDA can offer incentives to keep the property in the program. Incentives to stay in the program are an important preservation tool. USDA has the authority to add rental assistance to a project in exchange for a promise for 20-year use restrictions to keep the property for low-income housing uses for 20 years. They could, some other incentives USDA could offer would be increasing the annual return to the owner or providing an equity loan to the property owner. I get drawing quicker than you do. USDA recently received $1 million to provide grants to qualified nonprofit organizations and public housing authorities to provide technical assistance for properties with maturing mortgages and potential purchasers. Stakeholders thought that this was going to be a useful tool, and USDA recently awarded 4 contracts for this. So this is something that's a new development and in the early phases of being adopted. Simplifying the processes. The processes for preservations are very complicated. Stakeholders identified simplification of the NPR process and the state and local bond transactions would help make the process easier. There were some statewide collaborations, such as those in Minnesota and Oregon, have helped make preservation feasible. Stakeholders also suggested that USDA could make full use of all the NPR tools. A lot of the NPR tools that are used are deferring debt, but USDA also has the authority to provide loan forgiveness, soft second loans, grants, and other forms of financial assistance that they would also like to be used more. Stakeholders indicated there are a number of ways to cut costs without sacrificing program integrity. It's estimated that 20 to 30% of a project operating cost is based on utilities. Reducing energy costs could have a significant impact on the operating costs for the units. Another example might be adjusting audit requirements for small properties that have had no past audit findings, so they would not be required to hire a CPA every year to do an audit. There have been some bills introduced in Congress to improve the LIHTC program, the low-income housing tax credit program, that could have a significant impact on the value of tax credits to investors to help them generate more capital for preservation and for production. Stakeholders shared in some states that there have been set-asides of portions of the housing tax credits, especially for the 9% credits, that have had good results in rural preservation. Tenants include seniors and persons with disabilities who are living on fixed income, single-parent households, and others. There are very few affordable options for rental in rural areas, and if property leaves the program, tenants have few options. But this does not mean that every 515 property is essential, and Keith talked about some of this in the risk analysis. Establishing high priority projects. Some factors for considering prioritizing properties might include market characteristics, significance to the community, impact on primarily minority communities, and the level of need for the subsidized housing. The use of voucher funding has been growing as properties leave the program, but many eligible tenants are not receiving vouchers. USDA and property owners could send out earlier notices to tenants in properties that are at risk of maturing mortgages. Currently, the USDA is supposed to start notifying tenants at about 12 months before the loan matures. So some of the stakeholders thought an earlier notification process might be helpful. And the language should be sent in easy to understand, plain language, and in multiple languages where it's appropriate. Voucher payments are established at the time the property leaves the program. So when USDA issues a voucher to a tenant because the property is leaving the program, the amount is established based on the tenant's rent at the time and their circumstances at the time, but that does not change. HUD's housing choice vouchers are changed annually based on the rent where the tenant is living and tenant's income. Appropriation bills consistently state that the amount of the voucher should be the difference between the comparable rent for the 515 unit and the amount the tenant paid for rent. But USDA has not established a method for recalculating the voucher amount, so it doesn't change. Stakeholders noted that USDA has made significant improvements in its prepayment processes, and the process is a lot more consistent across the states than they once were. But there is no common process for determining impact on minority communities. A standardized process would be very helpful. Smaller and more remote properties are often among the most challenging to preserve. we saw that they were more likely to leave the property in the analysis that Keith was talking about. Stakeholders suggest that USDA explore alternatives for preserving units, such things as permitting mixed use for a property, family and elderly, temporary shelters, assisted living, or combinations of these, as appropriate, subject to fair housing laws. Another option is to consider conversion to resident cooperatives. These are things that were suggested. We talked about the direct participants in the program, USDA, the tenants, and the owners, but the public also has a stake in this. Private sector financing, including tax credits and USDA's loan guarantee program, can provide desperately needed resources for owners and purchasers. Other sources of rental subsidy besides USDA's rental assistance also helps keep it affordable. A good percentage of rental assistance comes from HUD, Housing Choice Vouchers, and Project Section 8. There's a little bit of subsidy from other sources, so these are other sources that could be brought in to assist in keeping the units affordable. The duty to serve requirements. Rural rental preservation is a component in both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's duty to serve plans, and that could increase lender interest in preservation. Stakeholders noted that despite the risks of subordinating debt to new financing, it has been a helpful tool for preservation. They also support the continued use of 515 funds to current borrowers or purchasers who assume 515 loans. Permanent authorization of the MPR and preservation revolving loan funds would be helpful. These were introduced in appropriation bills as demonstration programs. We know we've got at least 20 to 30 more years of maturing mortgages to come, so moving beyond a demonstration would be beneficial. It's important to note that vouchers cannot replace other preservation efforts. If a tenant moves away from the community, that community would lose the affordable housing represented by the vouchers. So while they're important, they don't replace preservation. Voucher resources are limited. So stakeholders made a point of noting that it's not appropriate to issue vouchers for tenants and properties where USDA allows the tenant or the owner to prepay and the property still has use restrictions on it. So some of the prepayment properties carry use restrictions into the future, and it's not appropriate to issue vouchers for the tenants that are going to continue to live in that property when the owner is obligated to keep it affordable. And rural housing developers and owners working in states for preservation have found state housing trust and multifamily housing bond programs to be a valuable resource. Then there were cross-cutting strategies. Almost every strategy we talked about cuts across multiple groups. Extending the loan repayment schedule, the re-amortizing 515 loans allows the rental assistance to continue. That's an important preservation strategy. Some appropriation bills, Congress has specifically provided for USDA to use rental assistance contracts as an incentive to keep the 515 in place. Stakeholders believe that the agency has authority to move these contracts, even if that language is not specifically mentioned in the appropriation bill. Some clarification from Congress might help with that. USDA has undertaken many steps in recent years to preserve its rental portfolio, but stakeholders were not aware of any comprehensive strategy to guide USDA's preservation efforts. They believed it would be useful to have a strategy with goals and milestones to track along the way. So USDA's 515 program provides a crucial source of good quality affordable rental homes. We've already lost a number of homes to maturing mortgages and prepayments. Our analysis found that loans are maturing at a slower rate than previously estimated, so there is more time to develop strategy, more time. We need to get a strategy and prevent more units from leaving the program. Lance?
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to, in the interest of time, I think we'll move to what we had already alluded. I'm going to skip over. We do have a series of resources that are available. If we have time at the end of the discussion today, I'll talk about those. There's some interactive resources that are kind of a complement to the research. But I really want to move to the panel of experts to kind of talk about some of these issues. So I don't want to waste much time. We're going to set up just a couple of minutes here to get some chairs so they're somewhat comfortable. And I'll skip through these relatively quickly, but I would ask the panel to come up and kind of start at this point. So if we could give us a few seconds. Are there any burning questions that anyone has kind of from the research that we can answer while the panel is getting set up? So one of the panelists has a question.
Can you remind me of how long the mortgage terms were? I know they were as long as 50 years, but did they get shorter at that point?
I think they range from 30 to 50 years.
Yeah, they could be up to 50 years. And then in the late 80s, it was changed to 30 years with 50-year amortization.
So thanks, Mike. I really want to move to this part because I think it really complements the research and is a major component. So we're grateful to have 3 experts here to talk about these issues and get their reflections on the data, but also give some insights. I would say I'm maybe going to steal someone's thunder, but this is what we call the AAA panel. So there's Andy Saavedra, who needs no introduction. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Andrea Ponzer and Andrew Winter. So you have to have some variation there. And Andy's name is Andres. But so we have this panel covered. But I'm really looking forward to this component of it. I will let them kind of introduce themselves. But Andy is from Rural LISC. Andrea Ponzer is from Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, and Andrew Winter is from the Twin Pines Housing Trust. I would be remiss if I didn't note that both Andrew and Andy are also related to HAC. They're board members at the Housing Assistance Council. We appreciate that service as well. So Thank you.
I'm glad to be here. Just very briefly, wanted to introduce Andrew. He's the Executive Director of Twin Pines Housing Trust, leading developer of affordable housing in the Upper Valley region of New Hampshire and Vermont for individuals and families with moderate and low incomes. And the main reason we really wanted Andrew here was he oversaw the acquisition of 100 units of USDA rural development housing in Lebanon, New Hampshire, which were at risk of being lost as affordable housing. And I know 515 is so exciting, but when it comes right down to it, this is really about grandma and where grandma's going to live. And with my job at LISC, what I'm trying to figure out is how to help groups like Andrew be able to find a place for grandma to still be able to live. And this really is a crisis that we all need to address. And then next we have Andrea Ponzer, who's the Chief Operating Officer, Executive Vice President for Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, a nonprofit collaborative of 11 exemplary multi-state nonprofit affordable housing providers who own more than 115,000 rental homes, and their mission is to lead policy innovation and advance excellence in the delivery of affordable housing. Andrea also worked with us as our federal policy director at LISC. So I used to always run to her office and say, Andrea, explain this to me. And now I get to do it in front of a live studio audience. So we have about 10 questions that were developed that I want to run through quickly. And then maybe if we have some time, some questions from the field. We've got a who's who of housing wonks in the room here. And then possibly for what Lance wanted to still kind of go through. So briefly, Andrew and Andrea, they call me Andrew at Starbucks. The nuns call me Andrew in school. It all was like running in my head. But briefly, how is your organization involved with rural rental properties?
So Twin Pines, as you said, is an owner, developer, and manager of affordable housing in the Upper Valley region of New Hampshire and Vermont. We've got a portfolio of about 417 units currently, multifamily units. We also do home ownership. We got involved as an owner of affordable housing, of USDA affordable housing back in 2012. We actually did one of the last 515 projects at that point. So as that program was rolling down in terms of producing new units with rental assistance, we were fortunate to get some of that for a 21 unit project. And then this project that you mentioned, the village, what we call the Village of Crafts Hill today, originally Pine Tree and Beechwood, was a property that had been developed in two phases, 1975, 1978, by a large developer of multifamily housing in New Hampshire. He had about 2,900 units at the time that we acquired the units from him and his company. And he had arrived at a moment in the life cycle of his property where it was going to be lost as affordable housing. 50 units would be lost. And in our region of the state, that was going to be a significant impact. So we decided to step up and work with USDA and work with that owner to acquire the units and acquire the additional 50 units adjacent to it, 100 units in total, to preserve those. So that's our little bit of background on our experience.
Awesome. Andrew?
So like you said, SAFE is a collaborative. We're actually up to 13 large, high-functioning nonprofit developers. We operate in 49 states, DC, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And in the member portfolio of about 138,000 units, there are several dozen 515 properties. The members have been involved both many years ago at the front end, but also in preservation transactions over time.
Great. Let me discuss any of your activity or intersection with USDA rural housing. You kind of actually talked about that a little bit already, but let me get some of your observations or initial reactions to what you just heard, to the report.
Yeah, so, one of the things that I observed as we went through this was, I think there was a comment about grandma, and this really is about grandma. So when the word first got out in early 2015, I think it was April 1st, most of the residents received the letter, and I think they probably all thought it was an April Fool's joke that at the end of the year, the end of 2015, that they would be losing their rental assistance and potentially facing the prospect of not being able to afford the rent. Most of the folks who lived at this particular property, disabled, senior, single parent households, average income about $16,000. And so the possibility of losing that housing was immediate. There was fear. There was a sense of loss, of community being lost. And so, we can talk about it being, relatively low number of units being lost at that time. But for those folks, and for what it meant for our community, it was dramatic and significant. We were fortunate as we were trying to mobilize support for potential acquisition that it really played out in our local media. This was a story that was covered front and center. The Valley News, our local newspaper, was at the forefront of leading the charge and talking about the impact to the residents and putting a human face on those stories. And so we were able to, kind of step up and step forward. But again, I kind of come back to the fact that for a lot of communities, these are very, very important units. And that was something that jumped out at me as we kind of talked about the larger issues. And I know we're going to touch a little bit more on some of the specific issues, but that was one observation. Great.
Anything you want to add? Okay.
We can move on.
I mean, being a national, it's a different question. HAC's research report looked at the type of rental properties financed by USDA and the kind of people who live there. What are these properties and their tenants like in your market and portfolio? We're noticing it's all a little bit different everywhere else. Tell me a little more about what you're seeing where you are, and Andrew, if you might have anything from your member groups that you might want to chime in.
New Hampshire and Vermont are two of the most white states in the country. So as you might expect, we're seeing a relatively, in terms of race, white population there. But we are also, seeing very much that this was an important, this particular project was a really important source of housing for seniors and disabled, as well as a number of single-parent households. I think I mentioned the fact that $16,000 was about the average income. So these are folks, if they lose rental assistance and they're out in the marketplace having to find housing, instead of paying 30% of their income, $100, $300, $500 a month in rent, they might be looking at having to pay $1,000 or $1,200 or $1,500 a month in rent. And for them, in our particular market, that's huge and it's a huge impact.
Thank you. Quite a few rental properties in your communities or portfolios have USDA mortgages that will end. The technical term is that they'll mature within the next 15 years. Then the owners won't be required to keep them affordable for low-income tenants, though they could choose to. Do you expect owners to keep running to the same kind of tenants they do now?
In our market, one of the challenges was, as I mentioned, the market rate rents are higher. In fact, 2-bedroom rents in Lebanon, New Hampshire can be as much as $2,400 a month. And that's driven in part by the fact that Lebanon is also home to Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, which is one of the largest employers, private employers in the state of New Hampshire. It's adjacent to Hanover, New Hampshire, which is home to Dartmouth College, an Ivy League institution. And between those two institutions, there are a lot of people moving into the marketplace and a lot of demand for housing. So we see a very, very low rental vacancy rate, typically under 2.5% to 3%. We see a very low unemployment rate right now. So we've got a really tight housing market. And for the owner of the property in 2015, he was able to kind of look at this and say, well, I can spend some money on this property, I can fix it up, and I can boost the rents. And so that was a real option for him. And we needed to say, look, this is a great opportunity for you to do the right thing, help us preserve this really important asset. So in our community, it was a hot market that was enticing to that individual owner to look at potentially going to market. But that's not true, everywhere in the country. And there are some markets where, smaller properties may in fact want to stay in the market, in the program. And there are other locations where it may not make financial sense to get out. But in particularly in a market like Lebanon, New Hampshire, and in some of the markets that maybe are closer to areas where there's been outward growth from urban centers, there may be demand for housing that encourages people to take the units out of the program.
Okay. The follow-up question to that was, can the tenants just move somewhere else? But in cases where there isn't anything available.
Yeah. So one of the challenges that we had was, and maybe the numbers are a little bit off. I don't know if Keith, you mentioned it, but we were talking about, I was looking up on the chart for counties where where the projects represented 50% or more of the affordable housing. And this particular property with 88 of the 100 units being affordable represented about 50% of the non-age restricted housing in our area in New Hampshire, our service area in New Hampshire. So the loss of that would have had a really significant impact. That means the tenants have a really hard time finding someplace to go. Today, the 12 one-bedroom units, the subsidized one-bedroom units, have 128 people on the wait list. So that means that if you're on that wait list, you are probably never going to get into that property. If there is that kind of demand, and there are wait lists of 2, 3, 4, 5 years to get into subsidized affordable units in our region. So if you need that subsidy, as many of these residents did, there are very, very few options available.
Okay. Do you expect to see a difference in what happens to apartment complexes close to urban and suburban markets as opposed to rural areas? I mean, some of these projects are in areas where it's growing around them and they're no longer quite as rural as they used to be.
I mean, I think Andrew's alluded to a lot of that. I think when you're in an urban and suburban market, we're seeing studies talking about how there's no county in the United States that has enough affordable housing, and that pressure is much greater often in urban and suburban markets. There's more competition to buy that asset and more incentive for large owners that may have clusters of properties there and see this as one more thing that can become part of that. So you may see very different behaviors than places that are seeing, population declines, or where there may not be the same cluster of activity where someone would have the interest in investing.
Thank you. So if the first peak doesn't happen until 2027, I think it was, or 2028, as you saw in the report, do we really need to worry about this now?
Yes.
Yeah, we really do. I don't know if you want to add something more to that, but I'll jump in and just say, the individual residents who live there, whether it's Billy who still lives there and had been in this particular property for 20 years and was a strong advocate for us and for USDA to work together to preserve these units. It's her home. It is her home. It has been a place where she has raised a family, where she has developed a community, and so for her to lose that is dramatic and impactful. And our job was to kind of step up and try to preserve that individual unit. And I think we all have an obligation. These resources are there. The federal government has committed hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in developing this housing and funding it. And we have an obligation to take seriously each individual unit in ensuring that they continue to serve folks in the community.
Right, and I got a lot to say here. You saw the heat maps, right? Like, yes. The first peak is not evenly distributed. This is at crisis level in some regions now. And even if we started today, coming up with a solution is going to take some period of time. The best solutions we've come up with over time in the broader housing community have been demonstration programs too. It takes time to prove out a concept and make this attractive to capital markets. 10 years is actually not a lot of time to get something at scale and to think for sort of the public policy and the financial solutions we're looking for. Now is the time to start so that you have no one and no community that's out there without some sort of resource. The other thing we're up against is this first wave of tax credit properties that had those 30-year restrictions. Those start maturing in 2020 too. So you're going to have these much larger waves of properties competing for the same pool of resources that we have right now, and we're going to be in the mix. And if we're still sitting around going, well, this is really hard, and these deals are really small, and we don't know how to scale this, we're not going to win in that fight to get those limited resources. So I think now is absolutely the time to be thinking about ways to get this get the stock into the hands of folks that know how to preserve it.
And I will, to that point, you mentioned small projects, and we were really fortunate in that 100 units in a town of 13,000 people is big. And, it's a kind of project that gets attention from the local media. It's a kind of project that gets attention from the congressional delegation in terms of trying to preserve it. Much harder when it's 10 units or 20 units or 12 units in a smaller community to kind of get the attention. And so it is important that we start working on this now and giving it time and effort and attention.
So getting funders to help out with a demonstration project for rural intermediaries to try to do something about this would be cool. Okay. Third to last question. What can states be doing to evaluate the risk to the 515 stock and the role they can play in helping preserve units?
So I think they can start by reading Lance's great and lengthy report, Pat's great and lengthy report. There's some great examples out there where states have worked collaboratively, as in Minnesota, with the Interagency Stabilization Group, to really try and develop an early warning system and a good network for understanding what's at risk and really looking at this data and marshaling the resources to preserve it. So I think that's one way. In Virginia, there is a pretty good line of communication between the State Housing Finance Agency and USDA when there is a preservation deal. I think it could be better, and I think they would agree. But there are a lot of opportunities there. And then thinking about rural set-asides, how those resources at the state level are used, and how they work and don't work for rural deals, and particularly these 515 deals. And then, getting even more hopeful, state housing credits provide additional resources and make deals more viable. If more states had viable credit programs and were thoughtful about how to deploy them to rural communities, you'd have additional resources for the greater pool of housing preservation.
And you've had some states that have gone in the other direction on their housing tax credits, unfortunately.
Missouri.
Right.
You know, one of the other challenges in some states, we work in New Hampshire and Vermont. Both states are small states. Vermont, 660,000 people, gets a small state minimum. New Hampshire, 1.3 million people, gets a small state minimum. And so the ability of those states to have significant dollars to deploy to kind of fix USDA's issues here with the portfolio is limited. And that's one of the challenges of kind of looking at 9% credits and other credits and 4% credits as a tool. Both states, Vermont puts more money at the state level into affordable housing preservation and production. New Hampshire puts very little in. And so it's not necessarily a solution. And, there's a little bit of pushback. Both states want to be producing new units. They need to be producing new units. And so it's harder to kind of look at them and say, well, you really need to be using 9% credits to preserve this housing while they've got other, other demands on those funds as well. We need to grow the pot of resources so that we can adequately address this important need.
I had something I wanted to say. I'm thinking of recommendations to hack on that, maybe some best practices or highlighting some best practices of what states are doing or some ideal QAP policies from some states could be something we could follow up on. Okay. What kind of things will your respective organizations be trying to do to help? I mean, you're doing it. That's more of a Andrew
Sure.
question in terms of how you help your groups.
Right. So at the operational level, the members are out there looking at preservation opportunities, both within their own portfolio and without. They're large nonprofits. They bring a lot to bear. But the reality of trying to process a preservation deal through RD and the limited options for preservation make this something that's challenging, and they can't quite get to the scale they'd like to get to. So we'll continue to look for policy solutions and work in coalition with HAC and with you and with others around that. What we do think is a potential solution is operating at portfolio level. So they're interested to hear from groups like Greystone and Hallmark and others that are aggregating dozens of properties and hundreds or over 1,000 units and figuring out how to, in a portfolio manner, finance them and gain some efficiencies.
And to that end, I think there are some opportunities for some smaller agencies to work collaboratively together to try to acquire portfolios. I mean, our experience was helpful for the Lakes region, regional housing organization in New Hampshire, as they looked to acquire some portfolio units. So from the same seller, and so there are opportunities to collaborate even on a smaller scale.
I was going to mention them briefly. I mean, at LISC we're CDFI, so we offer pre-development construction, some mini-perm lending. In the case of Lakes Region, we actually have recoverable grants that are helping with pre-development, for that project.
Yeah.
So that's one of the ways that we can help.
And to that point, one of the challenges that we faced right out the door was we were going to have to, basically USDA was going to help us with the acquisition of the property in terms of, the purchase price, but they were not in a position to help us with the pre-development expenses that go on. And were it not for the fact that we're in a relatively affluent part of New Hampshire where we could go out to individual donors and look for folks to help us. And we had a donor write a check for $150,000 and say, here, I want you to save this housing. It's that important. And we were fortunate to be able to do that, but that's not a way to run a program. That's a way to fix a one-time problem, and we need to come up with some better solutions.
Okay. Lastly, just wanted to hit on what other recommendations that you might have. As we prepped for this, we had a few things. You had mentioned looking at how those big portfolios are working. There were a few others.
Sure. I mean, I think fully funding the MPR, the Multifamily Preservation and Renovation Program, is critically important. We acquired a 40-year-old property. Great. It's a 40-year-old property. The windows are falling out. They're energy inefficient. And we're fortunate in that we had, when we acquired, we started advocating for MPR money as part of the acquisition. It's taken us 3 years. The MPR money that we hope to get is not there. So we're now getting 515 money that is going to help fund renovations. Is it enough? No, we're out looking for other other pots of money, but we'll cobble together what we can to make sure that we're able to keep the property up and operating effectively for people. You know, we can't have windows falling out. We need to make sure the buildings are properly insulated. We need to make sure the air quality in the buildings is good once we start tightening up the envelopes of those buildings. And so that work requires a fully funded NPR program. Beyond that, you know, one of the other things that really stood out to me as we went through this process was the importance of transparency, not just for the owners, but for the residents, and the timeliness of notification. So the property, April 1st, residents find out that in 2015 that the property was at risk of being lost as affordable housing. Well, the owner had actually gotten a letter earlier in 2014 that said, you know, you're going to lose your rental assistance in 28 days. And, you know, thanks to the creativity of folks at the state level who were able to put in place a small loan, they were able to keep the rental assistance going for another year. But giving folks 8 months notice isn't enough, particularly in tight markets. And, you know, one of the things that I really was sad to see was there were residents, particularly those residents who in some cases were, you know, the workforce in our region choosing to move. Those with the most options, they get up and move. And so we lost one family to Virginia. They said, we're moving from New Hampshire to Virginia because we've lost this housing. And that was a fellow that worked at the local supermarket who had his kids in a local school and was part of the community. And that's unfortunate when we're losing people because we're not giving them enough notice and enough tools to stay in the community.
You know, I think it would be helpful, and Lance alluded to this, to know more about the properties that have exited, to contextualize the prepayments that have happened. I think looking to prepayment is an important thing. Not every prepayment is a loss of affordability, not only because of the USDA restrictions, but because you may be bringing on other financing that retains some level of affordability. Now, rental assistance and that deeper subsidy are, you know, potentially a different question, but understanding what you've lost, and I think really partnering with tenants and with USDA as an ownership and an advocacy community to talk about, you know, what different paths look like, and that you shouldn't be fearful of a prepayment that will continue to restrict a property and may continue to provide some subsidy. That should not take 18, 24, 36 months to process. That's not helpful to the larger preservation cause. So I think both looking backwards and forwards about how you can make that process more efficient, more comfortable and clear for the tenants will actually help these deals get done. Because what you hear a lot in the ownership community is, I just want out of this. It's a big regulatory burden on a small property, and the process for preserving it takes too long and costs too much.
It shouldn't take a fire drill to get a project preserved. And, you know, that's unfortunately sometimes the situation that we're finding ourselves in. And that's unfair to the tenants and it's unfair to the owners. And frankly, you know, it puts a lot of stress on the agency to try to preserve that housing.
Let me stop there, and I didn't even get to decoupling, but wanted to get it back to Lance. We have a couple of minutes left if you wanted to try to
thank you.
cover it, or
Really thank Andrea, and Amy. They confirmed my hypothesis or assertion that this was going to be the best part of the discussion today. So it was really helpful. I think it really contextualized and really bolstered kind of the discussion that we had. So I really appreciate that perspective. I do think we have a couple of minutes. If we have a burning question, I think people can posit questions via the live stream as well. I'll probably deflect most of the questions to the experts, but if anyone has a question in the interim, if we don't have any questions, I would note, and I'm not going to bring it back up on the screen, but we do have some interactive resources and some additional resources. There is the 130 page. We do have some condensed versions of this, and we also have some related materials, and we will be releasing them kind of in a phase or in a period over the next month or so, looking at this from legislative districts, things of that nature. So some interactive tools to help continue this discussion. David alluded to this. I'm going to very quickly mention this as well, because we have representatives from the Urban Institute in the room. Amanda is here with us from the Urban Institute. This is called, the larger report is called Rental Housing for a 21st Century Rural America. This is simply phase one. There is another 100+ page report that'll be released in a few weeks, and it's called A Platform for Production. And it acknowledges that this is a finite resource, and then we need to think it's not only a finite resource, it's a finite and a declining resource, right? We can acknowledge that. It serves a very important which is very important, and it serves an important use, but we have to acknowledge that it's not built and it's not producing units right now. We need to think about production. So that's what that report will focus on in the coming weeks, so stay tuned on that particular element. So again, I would open it up. I would say just generally my kind of closing comments here. One, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. This is not the beginning of discussion. I've been working here not as long as many people in the room, but for the past 20 years now, in my first few days at HAC, coming to these meetings, right? So this is not the beginning, right? People have been talking about this for a while. And it's certainly not the end. We think this is a good juncture, an important juncture, and we try to inform sound policies and strategies. And we know that this will go on. I do think one of the overarching messages is that we do have a little bit of time. Let's not squander that, quite frankly. We have an opportunity here to address this issue before it truly does become a real crisis. Not to say it's not a crisis now, because it is a crisis for those 74 properties that are being lost every year, quite frankly. But it's going to get much more dramatic in a very short period of time. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and we will continue discussion. So thank you very much.